On January 24th, 2026, the history of the British monarchy was rewritten not with a roar of cannons or a public proclamation, but with the scratch of a single fountain pen in a silent room. For over 5 years, critics had demanded it. They called for the Duke of Sussex to be stripped of his status, arguing that you cannot walk away from the crown while still selling its prestige. But for King Charles, the decision was never about public opinion. It was about survival. What finally forced the king's hand wasn't a tell-all book or a scandalous interview. It was a red-sealed folder delivered by intelligence services that contained information so sensitive fewer than 10 people on Earth were allowed to see it. It was a document that turned a wayward son into a national security liability. This is the story of the morning a father had to destroy his own child to save the institution he served. And the details of what the FBI found, well, that changes everything. The morning of January 24th didn't feel historic. Inside the ancient thick stone walls of the palace, the routine was exactly the same as it had been for 100 years. The polished marble floors echoed with the sound of efficient footsteps. Tea was poured into china cups at exactly 8 o'clock a.m., and the winter sunlight struggled to push through the tall windows. But inside King Charles's private study, the air was heavy. It felt like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks, where the pressure builds until it becomes hard to breathe. Charles sat alone at his desk. At 77 years old, the weight of the crown was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical burden that pressed down on his shoulders. He was surrounded by the painted eyes of his ancestors, kings and queens who had navigated wars, abdication crises, and scandals that threatened to topple the throne. But none of them had faced exactly this. The door to the study opened without a knock. This was the first sign that the day would not be normal. His principal private secretary entered the room, his face pale, his lips drawn into a tight, grim line. Behind him walked 2 senior diplomats. These weren't the usual palace aides who handled schedules and charity events. These were men who moved with the quiet, dangerous urgency of a crisis team. In their hands, they carried folders marked with bright red wax seals, the universal signal within the palace that absolute silence was required. Charles felt his chest tighten. He didn't need to ask why they were there. The secretary spoke in a voice so low it was almost a whisper. "Communications have arrived through multiple channels," he said. "Diplomatic back channels and security services. They all point to the same source, the Duke of Sussex." The name hung in the air. For years, mentioning Harry had brought a mix of sadness and frustration, but this tone was different. This wasn't about family drama. The secretary placed the folder on the desk. "There have been developments at the California residence," he said. The word residence struck Charles. It sounded clinical, distant, a place beyond the protection of the crown. "Information has reached us from Washington," the aide continued. "The details are sensitive, delicate, and dangerous." Charles stared at the folder. He knew that opening it would cross a line he could never uncross. He thought of the little boy with the scraped knees running through the gardens at Highgrove. He thought of the young man walking behind his mother's coffin. But that boy was gone. In his place was a man who had chosen a path that had now led them to this precipice. "I want absolute silence on this," Charles said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "No leaks, no whispers, not yet." But the silence in the room only amplified the noise in his own head. The folder sat there waiting, and what was inside wasn't just gossip, it was the end of the road. It took 3 full minutes for the king to touch the report. Outside, the bustle of London continued, buses rumbling, tourists snapping photos of the guards, completely unaware that the monarchy was teetering on a razor's edge inside. When Charles finally broke the wax seal, the sound seemed deafening in the quiet room. He opened the cover. The first page didn't have a dramatic title. It was terrifyingly bureaucratic. "Subject investigation into Sussex, California operations." The word investigation made Charles feel cold. This wasn't a tabloid report. This wasn't a compilation of mean tweets or public complaints. This was intelligence. The report summary made it clear this inquiry hadn't started in London. It had started across the Atlantic. The FBI had been forced to look into the Sussexes' dealings not because they wanted to target a royal, but because they had no choice. Patterns had emerged. Financial flows and communications had been flagged by algorithms designed to catch serious players, not celebrities. As Charles turned the pages, the picture became clearer and more sickening. The report outlined meetings and transactions that on the surface might have looked like charity work or media deals. But when you connected the dots as the intelligence report did, it revealed a web of foreign interests. The phrase appeared again and again. Harry had been careless. That was the charitable interpretation. He had allowed himself to be surrounded by people whose loyalty was not to him and certainly not to the British crown. The report detailed private assurances given to individuals who were known to be hostile to Western alliances. It spoke of unguarded influence, a polite way of saying that the Duke of Sussex was being used as a pawn by people far smarter and more dangerous than he realized. There was a section marked with a red asterisk information requiring immediate attention. Charles read it 4 times. It suggested that Harry, in his desperate bid for financial independence and relevance, had walked into rooms he shouldn't have entered and shaken hands with people he shouldn't have met. He had become a vulnerability. The report didn't accuse Harry of malice. It didn't say he was a traitor. In some ways, that would have been easier to process. Instead, it painted a picture of staggering naivety. A prince who thought his title protected him when in reality his title was the very thing making him a target. The intelligence assessment was brutal. The Duke of Sussex is now an unsecured asset operating in a high-risk environment. Charles felt physically ill. This went beyond embarrassment. If this information became public, if the world found out that the king's son had inadvertently compromised the impartiality of the crown or entangled himself with foreign actors, the damage would be irreparable. The monarchy relies on being above the fray. Harry was now dragging them into the mud of international intrigue. But the most chilling part wasn't what the report said, it was what it implied. It implied that the crown could no longer guarantee Harry's safety or the safety of the information he held as long as he remained a private citizen acting like a rival court. The California operations had to be shut down. The door opened again, and this time, Charles didn't look up. He knew who was coming. His 3 most senior advisors entered the room. These men were the men in gray suits that Diana had once warned about the machinery that kept the institution running regardless of who sat on the throne. They arranged themselves before the desk like a tribunal. Their faces were grim. They had read the report before bringing it to the king. They knew the score. The first advisor spoke, his voice steady. "Your Majesty, this is no longer a family matter. The situation has evolved. What seemed like personal choices and private rebellions now carry implications for state security." Charles looked at them. He saw no sympathy in their eyes, only duty. They were right, of course. The second advisor picked up the thread. Protecting Prince Harry has always been complicated, but protecting him now, given these findings, could actively endanger the institution. If we continue to allow him to use his titles while operating in this manner, it implies the crown endorses these associations. The words landed like punches. Endorsement, that was the key. By letting Harry remain a royal highness, Charles was effectively co-signing every risky deal and every questionable meeting Harry took in California. The third advisor leaned forward. "We need to discuss containment, strategies. If this breaks in the foreign press before we act, we will look weak. We will look like we were hiding this. The narrative will not be that we took action. It will be that we were caught covering up for a liability." Liability. There it was again. Charles thought of the years he had spent trying to bridge the gap, the phone calls that went unanswered, the olive branches that were snapped. He had tried to be a father, but in this room with this report on the desk, he couldn't be a father. He had to be the king. If this becomes public, Charles whispered, the fear evident in his voice. What survives? The room fell silent, because everyone knew the answer. If the full extent of Harry's vulnerability and the risks he had taken were exposed while he was still a working-level royal in name trust in the monarchy, would shatter. The public would ask why the king hadn't acted sooner. They would ask if the king put his son above the safety of the nation. "We have to act," the advisor said. "The crown is bigger than any one person. It has survived for 1,000 years because hard decisions were made when they were necessary. Charles stood up and walked to the window, turning his back on them. He watched the innocent world outside. He knew what they were asking. They were asking him to cut the cord, to publicly and legally sever the tie, to strip the titles not out of spite, but out of necessity. "Prepare the documents," Charles said to the glass, "but I want a full legal review. Every detail must be unassailable." If the morning was defined by the cold logic of advisors, the afternoon brought the burning heat of personal conflict. Prince William arrived at the palace without a motorcade, without fanfare. He came in a black car, entering through a side gate. His arrival wasn't on the official diary. This was off the books. William entered the study where the report still lay on the desk. The tension between the brothers had been the subject of global speculation for years, but the reality in that room was far colder than any headline could capture. William didn't look like a brother concerned for his sibling. He looked like a future king looking at a threat to his inheritance. He sat down, his posture rigid. He didn't ask to see the report. He had already been briefed on the key points. "I suspected something was wrong." William said, his voice devoid of emotion. He's been reckless for years. Reckless with his words, reckless with his privacy. It was only a matter of time before he was reckless with something that actually mattered. Charles tried instinctively to soften the blow. "He didn't know, William. He's naive. He's been exploited." William raised a hand, cutting his father off. The gesture was shocking in its authority. "It doesn't matter if he knew," William said sharply. "The damage is the same. This isn't about defending him anymore, Pa. This is about protecting the institution, protecting my children, protecting the next generation." That was the argument Charles couldn't defeat. William was right. Harry's actions, his operations in California, were creating shockwaves that would eventually hit William's reign. Harry made his choices. William continued, his blue eyes hard. He chose to leave. He chose to sell our secrets. He chose to build a life outside. And now, through negligence or stupidity, he has created a security nightmare. If we let him keep the titles, we are saying this behavior is acceptable. "He is still my son," Charles said quietly. "And he is my brother," William shot back. "But I am the heir, and you are the king. We don't have the luxury of sentiment. If this story breaks and Harry is still His Royal Highness, the crown looks incompetent. It looks like we are asleep at the wheel." William stood up and walked to the window, standing exactly where Charles had stood earlier. They looked like reflections of each other, one, the present, one, the future. "Delay is dangerous," William said. "The world doesn't pause for our feelings. If we don't control this narrative, someone else will. And if that happens, the monarchy might not survive it intact." He turned back to his father. "The crown must act before the world forces its hand. You know what you have to do." With that, William left. The conversation hadn't been long, but it had been decisive. The boy who had once been Harry's best friend and defender was gone. In his place was a strategist who understood that sometimes you have to amputate a limb to save the body. Charles did not sleep that night. How could he? The palace was silent, but his mind was a cacophony of memories and fears. He sat in his study until the early hours of the morning, the report closed but ever present on his desk. He pulled down books on history. He read about Edward VIII, the king who gave up everything for love and spent the rest of his life as a sad, drifting figure in exile. He read about George V, who had changed the family name to Windsor to survive the anti-German sentiment of World War I. The lesson was always the same: the family serves the crown. If the family endangers the crown, the family must be sacrificed. It was a brutal ancient logic, but it was the only logic that kept the monarchy alive. Charles looked at the phone. He thought about calling Harry, just to hear his voice, to warn him, to shout at him, to ask him why. Why couldn't he just have been happy? Why did he have to push so far? But Charles knew he couldn't make that call. If he called, he would weaken. He would hear his son's voice, perhaps hear the panic or the denial, and he might hesitate. And hesitation now was fatal. Furthermore, legal advisors had warned him against direct communication. Anything said on an unsecured line could be recorded, leaked, or used in the inevitable PR war that would follow. So the father chose silence. It was a cruel silence, perhaps the cruelest thing he had ever done. He was denying Harry the dignity of a warning. He was letting his son walk into an ambush. But Charles told himself it was necessary. The element of surprise was the only tactical advantage the palace had left. The night faded into a gray, cheerless dawn. Charles felt older than he ever had. He had survived the death of his parents, the breakdown of his marriage, the death of Diana. But this, actively dismantling his son's life with a signature, this was a different kind of pain. It was a cold, hollow ache in the center of his chest. At 9:30 a.m. on January 25th, the machinery of the state began to turn. The legal team arrived with the final documents. They were masterpieces of bureaucratic language. They didn't scream or shout. They simply stated in dry legal terms that due to changed circumstances and alignment with current operational status, the titles and styles held by the Duke of Sussex were being permanently rescinded. Charles read the document. It framed the decision as a necessary administrative update, not a punishment. It was designed to protect the crown's integrity. But Charles knew the truth. It was an erasure. He picked up his pen. His hand trembled just for a second. He looked at the paper. This was it. The moment of no return. Once the ink hit the page, Harry would no longer be a royal in any meaningful sense. He would just be Harry. Charles took a breath, steadied his hand, and signed. Charles R. The scratch of the pen sounded loud in the room. It was done. The red seal was applied. The document was collected by an aide with white gloves. There was no ceremony, no music, just the quiet shuffling of papers. Charles sat back in his chair, staring at the empty space on the desk where the document had been. He felt a strange numbness. He had done what William demanded. He had done what the intelligence services required. He had protected the crown. But as he sat there in the silence, he knew that history would remember this moment. They would look at the king who saved the monarchy, but they would also see the father who sacrificed his son. Across the ocean in Montecito, California, the sun was shining. It was 11:43 a.m. local time. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. While London was gray and tense, California was bright and breezy. Palm trees swayed. The world felt open and free. Harry was going about his morning routine. Maybe he was checking emails, maybe planning the next project. He had no idea that 5,000 miles away, his identity had just been legally dismantled. The notification didn't come via a royal courier or a grim-faced ambassador. It came via email, a formal notification from the Lord Chamberlain's office to the legal representatives of the Sussexes with a direct copy to Harry. Subject notification regarding royal status and titles. Harry opened it. He probably had to read it 3 times before the words actually made sense. The language was cold, precise, and final. His titles were gone. His HRH status removed. The patronages reassigned. It wasn't a suspension. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a fait accompli. He set the phone down. The silence in the California mansion must have felt sudden and absolute. For years he had feared this. He had fought against it. He had claimed it was his birthright. But now the screen stared back at him indifferent. He had expected a fight. He had expected an argument with his father, a shouting match with William. He had prepared for a battle of words. But he hadn't prepared for this. He hadn't prepared for the silence. He hadn't prepared to be deleted like a line item in a budget. The news would break to the world within the hour. The websites would crash. The news anchors would put on their serious faces. The internet would explode with opinions, outrage, and celebration. But in that moment, before the noise started, there was just the reality of the choice. King Charles had secured the safety of the crown. He had closed the California operation. He had neutralized the risk. But as the sun set over London and rose over California, the human cost was visible in the empty spaces between them. A family already fractured was now shattered beyond repair. The king had saved his throne, but he had lost his son forever. And as Charles looked out at the crowds gathering at the palace gates, unaware of what had just happened, he had to wonder, was the price too high? And what exactly was in that file that made a father choose duty over love? We may never know the full details, but on January 24th, 2026, we learned that for the Windsors, silence is the most dangerous weapon of all.